So last week we did some of the background Gemaras and the first like Aleph through Hay and the Torah Beit Yosef, and we said that this Siman is mostly focusing on the ideas of what constitutes like receiving the Kiddushin meaningfully or successfully, and what constitutes either sufficient consent or clear refusal. And so the part that we focused on last week was mostly more about the reception angle, right? About the fact that it doesn't have to have literally been placed in a woman's hand, that if it's thrown at her or thrown close to her in certain circumstances, either within her arba amot or in a case where she can guard it and he can't in scenarios like that, or in her chatzer, that these can count as her having sufficiently received the kiddushin. And we also saw that we learned a lot of this. Most of the Gemaras didn't explicitly deal with kiddushin. Most of them were focused more on paradigms of gerushin or mitziot. And so we also had the question of like, to what extent can we extend those to the topic of kiddushin? And we saw that especially in the chatzer case, that it wasn't like a perfect extension, that we ended up like drawing distinctions between the different scenarios. But today we're focusing more on the latter half, which is more on the topic of what constitutes the woman consenting, or what is a clear case of her refusing the kiddushin. Although in the scenario of the Sela, which is probably where we'll be spending a lot of time, because it's where we see the most sort of back and forth amongst some of the Rishonim and Achronim, we see kind of an overlap of the two issues, right? Both the idea of whether this is about indicating your dat, your consent, or whether this is about like actually acquiring the thing. So I think we're going to start off just with the Gemara on Kiddushin, because that a lot of this comes very directly from that Gemara. So this is starting on Kiddushin. Start with the Tanya Rabbanan Hikachi phrase that appears multiple times in the daf, but the first time that it appears on this Amud.
Sorry, Lexie, sorry, you were phasing in and out, at least on my computer. Which daf and Kiddushin are we on?
Sorry, yeah. Thing over, but we're doing Kiddushin 8b.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, this should be better. So, Andres, you feeling up to reading?
Kiddushin 8b, no?
Yeah, Kiddushin 8b. So starting with Tanya Rabbanan Hikachili b'maneh Natal Tov Zerak Toliyam.
Okay, I'm looking for it. Tanu Rabbanan. Okay, yeah. Should I read now?
Yeah.
Tanu Rabbanan. התכתשי במנה, נטלתו וזרקתו לים, או לאור, או לכל דבר האבד אינה מקודשת. שדיתניהו כמי הבו קידושין, כאמרה לי שקילה בעינה. Okay, so they're saying that the sages like he gave him the money, he gave her the money, and and then it was thrown to the water or to the fire, so it was destroyed.
Well, she threw it to the fire. He and says, "Be Mikdash to me," and she tosses it away.
And then she is not betrothed. And but the thing is that he already gave it to her, so she should be betrothed to him.
No, and, so here the Gemara is raising a kushya. So it said l'chol davar ha'aved, right? So the first part implies that like dafka, if she threw it like into the sea or into the fire where it would be lost, then she's eina mikudeshet. Which like what would that imply if it's dafka davar ha'aved?
That so the like money's lost and yeah.
That if she throws it back at him.
That if she just tossed it at his feet, maybe it's fine because it hasn't been lost. And so the Gemara is surprised at that suggestion. It's saying, is this like hash l'teinhu kame havu kiddushin, Like, if she just threw it in front of him, would that have been kiddushin? And we say like, Haka amrle shakia lobaina. Like, isn't that like her saying to him, like, take it. I don't want you. I don't want this. So then the Gemara is going to give an answer.
לא מבאי קה, אמר לה מבאי שדידניהו קמי דלא הבו קידושין, אבל זכרתו לים או לאור, אימה כיוון דמחייבה בהו קדושי, קדיש נפשה והדקה עבדה, אחי סברה אבדקי להי גברה, אי רדחנה הוא או לא, כמה שמלן.
Okay. So what does the lo mibaya ka'amar mean?
So he's saying that it's not necessary. Yeah.
That it's using the structure of lo mibaya, right? Like, and no need to say X.
That she throws the money. Because it was taught before that it wasn't kiddushin.
Isn't the thing, there's no need to say that she's not betrothed when she throws the money at him?
Right. It's saying that the resolution is like, it didn't need to teach you than the case where she just throws it in front of him, not to do a davar ha'aved, that she isn't mikudeshet. That like, that's like pshita, that we know that if she just tossed it in front of him, eina mikudeshet. Aval zarak toli yamul, or in the case where you did throw it away to something where it's lost, ema, right? You might have thought, what would I have thought?
He owes him the money.
Right. You might have thought that like, now that that money is lost, it's not just sitting in front of him. Maybe she owes him the money. Maybe this is some kind of like it's compared to our Rev somewhere in some of our commentaries, right? So like maybe because she now actually sort of owes him that money, that connection has been formed. And maybe she's aware of that. And this last bit was like, maybe she knew that, maybe she knew, since she's like losing his money, that she'll owe that to him and it'll form that connection. And she's just thinking, well, I'll see, if I'm going to be married to this guy, I want to see what his temper's like. So let's see how he reacts if I toss his kiddushin into the fire. And so Kamash Malan, that even in that scenario, our assumption is that that's her refusing it, not her saying, no, well, I accept this and let's just see what this guy's temper is.
In other words, by throwing it into the yam, you're actually accepting the money, because now you are obligated to pay him. If you don't accept the money now, you have to pay him other money. So by throwing it to the yam, you would be foolish to do that unless you were intending to get married to the guy and keep it.
Right. So that would be our Hava Amina, right? So like, that's why we needed this to be taught. You might have had a Hava Amina that like, since she knows if I like lose this guy's money, if I'm not getting married to him, I owe it back.
Exactly.
You might have assumed that she does mean to get married to him. Kamash Malan, no, that's probably her still saying, I don't want to get married.
In other words, exactly. Don't have that thought. Don't have that thought. And that's why the Mishnah came to teach us this, right?
Right. Whereas if she just throws it in front of him when she doesn't owe him anything, that just seems, even clearer to us that, of course, that's just her saying, I'm not interested in you. But now we have another scenario. So another Tani Rabbanan. Andres, do you feel good continuing?
Yeah. Tanu Rabbanan.
Lexie,
Yeah.
does she owe him the money?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, since
Okay,
like
so
she's not
the-
mikudeshet to him and she just threw away his dinar, I think she does owe him the money.
So we have a
Um,
chiluk between what? Chiluk between the intent or the action that needed to be accomplished and the implement itself, which is worth money.
Right. I think that it's basically like you can't say b'tarat matana, like she received it, because he explicitly said that he wants her to be mikudeshet to him. And so he's not just giving this with the intent of it being just a matana. So I think the assumption is that like if she's rejecting it and not taking it as kiddushin, it's not just a gift to her, ergo she would owe him that money if she gets rid of it.
I was going to ask about that. Is that
That's a
is
good
the-
way of, that's a good way of saying it.
Yeah, do we know that for sure that if a man gives a woman something and says Haret Mekudeshli, but tabadzo or whatever it is, that if she says no to the kiddushin, that the object itself doesn't go to her, that's not a valid kinyan if she takes the
think
object.
that's the case. I think that's the case. There is an interesting story. I'm actually like, we'll take a glance at that comes up in a tshuva later, just because I find it to be a really funny little tshuva, where it talks about when this woman is owed a debt from a guy and he gives it to her, and as he's giving it to her, he says, "Harei mekudeshet li," and there she like immediately tosses it away or whatever. But presumably, like once she's indicated that she does not want to be mekudeshet to him, she can then like pick that money back up because she's like owed that money. Whereas I'm assuming that in cases like where it's an explicit rejection and we say that that's why she's not mikudeshet, because she's explicitly indicating that she's not interested in kiddushin, and he has used like a very like lashon vadai of kiddushin. My assumption is that it's like you're just not accepting that from him. But I can look up sources to back that up. But in the meantime, I'm gonna suggest we continue with the Gemara, and I'll send out hopefully tonight or tomorrow some stuff about what the case would be. But that's my assumption, is that she would owe him the money. Okay. Tanu Rabbanan.
תנו רבנן, התקדשי לי במנה, אתנה אותם לאבא ולאביך אינה מקודשת על מנת שיקבלום לי מקודשת. So she was going to be given the money, and then she says, why don't you give it to my father? And then they say that she's not mekudeshet.
Right. Why is she not mikudeshet if he's like, be mikudeshet to me, and she's like, give it to my dad or give it to your dad?
על מנת שיקבלום לי מקודשת. Like,
well, that's a different scenario.
Okay. Because she didn't accept them in a way.
Right. Like he says,
Yeah.
like, be mikudeshet to me. And she's like, yeah, give it to that guy. And even in this case, it's not just that guy. It's not just Plony. It's like, give it to my father. She's still saying like, I don't want to be mikudeshet. But what's the second scenario? The almanat.
על מנת שיקבלום לי, and then she says, okay, you can give it to my father, but in the condition that he is accepting them for me, something like that, no?
Right. That like, if he's like, be mikudeshet to me with this, and she's like, I give it to my dad. That's her saying, I don't want to be mikudeshet. If he's like, be mikudeshet to me with this, and she's like, oh, give it to my dad and he'll take it on my behalf. That's just her essentially making him her shaliach, right? That's like her saying, I do want this kiddushin you're offering me, and I'm just saying you should give it to my father, right? But in the first scenario, our assumption is just that that's her way of saying like, I don't want this, give it to them. And now the Gemara is going to get into the phrasing a little bit. Sorry, what were you going to say?
Quick question. How is that different from what we were learning last week when she said, if you give this money to so-and-so, she's mikudeshet?
So
Now the so-and-so is her father.
There's a Rashi that clarifies this. So Asher, do you feel up to reading a Rashi or?
Not as much tonight,
Okay,
sorry.
so no worries. Andres, do you want to look at the Rashi on Ena Mikudeshet?
Okay, in the same part, no, isn't it?
Yeah, the Eno Dome.
Okay, give me a second. ואינו דומה לתן מנה לפלוני והקדיש לך דהתם היא כאמרה לי מעיקרא, אבל כאן, I don't know, משתהי בו, כלומר תן מעותיך לאחרים. Okay, so this is what you were explaining, that the difference between those two cases is that in this case, she's saying, like here, she's saying like, give it to someone else. Like, I don't want them, give it to someone else. But in the other case, she was saying from the beginning that to give the money to someone else, to Plony, and then I will be mekudeshet for you.
Right. So this is also like specifically comparing this to what Asher was raising, which is that in another Siman, we see that like she can tell him, like, give this money to Ploni and I'll be Mekudeshet to you. And Rashi also points out that like in that case, she's initiating that encounter, right? Like she's indicating she wants to be Mekudeshet to him. And she's telling the guy, give that money to Ploni so we can be engaged. Whereas here, he's initiating the encounter, being like, be Mekudeshet to me. And she's saying, give it to that guy, right? Here, like from the fact that he's initiating the encounter, and she just says, give it to that dude, Stam, with no indication that they're like receiving it on her behalf. It's like the phrase of like, mashtahibo, that like, that's just her way of refusing him. That's her way of saying, I'm not interested. Joel?
Yeah, I really understood it. I mean, like mashteg is to like is to jest or to fool, right? I think she's being coy here essentially, right? I think is the right English term to use, maybe. So you can question, right? She's like, you know, you can imagine the way I was imagining like a Humphrey Bogart, movie where he's doing, and like the woman's like, yeah, whatever, put it to this, you know, she's kind of, you know, pushing him away, but doing it in a very, you know, gentle manner.
She's being less like blatantly, like she's not just saying, no, I don't want to be engaged, but she's like in a more indirect, polite way, but still in a way that's like apparently clear enough to us. She's saying like, this isn't what I'm interested in. Yeah, Avni, did you have your hand raised?
No.
Can I just add one more thing? Is that okay? I think that's like the whole point here is kind of, I mean, I think you're saying this, but I just want to clarify it for myself too. Is like, there's this sense of, you know, we have to reveal what her idea is here. Like, is she which way she's thinking? And it really does seem from the Gemara here and from this Rashi that like the average case, we don't know one way or the other. We need evidence in either direction. You know, either evidence that she doesn't want it or evidence that she does want it. And the Stam case is like, we just don't know. I don't know if it plays out in other places, but just here it does. So
right. It's like, as I was saying last time, like we don't have like our paradigm of consent with Kiddushin is certainly not that of like enthusiastic consent. Like it's not one that we often talk about today, which is like the absence of a yes, like an enthusiastic yes is a no, because there are cases where it's like shatka, right? Where like we see that it's kind of like a more passive thing. But in the absence of like anything seemingly indicating refusal, we tend to incline towards, okay, that's acceptance. But if there's something that could be ambiguously or seemingly read as a refusal, then like we have different levels of that, right? Like here, we actually think it's a clear enough refusal that we just say Eina Mekudeshet. It's not Safek Mekudeshet, she's just Eina Mekudeshet. But some of the other scenarios that'll come up, it's Safek, where we're not clear whether that's like sufficiently her consenting enough that actually that would be effective, or whether that's like just another sort of coy way, as it were, of refusing. Okay, so the Gemara is I'm gonna real quick read the next bit just because it's the Gemara sort of explaining why it's phrased as it is. So you just have Tna Abba L'Hodiacha Koach the Reisha, Tna Avicha L'Hodiacha Koach the Seifa. So it taught like Abba to teach the strength of the ratio, that even if she says, give it to my father, she's still, if she doesn't say Almanat Shika Blumli, she's still not saying he's accepting it for me. That's still not her like agreeing to the Kiddushin. And it said Avicha to teach the strength of the Seifa, that like even though it's not her father, even though it's like Dafka, the guy giving its dad, the one who's like part of this family, that like he can still be made a shaliach and accept the money that this dude is trying to offer her as her kiddushin, and that's effective. So it's explaining that like we needed both of these examples to teach us the extremes of either case.
In other words, just to me, it adds what you're saying, that the father, the first case, you might think that, well, when she's saying, give it to my father, that's somebody who is dear to her, who she wants for his benefit. Maybe she's not rejecting it. And it's going to tell you, no, even though she said it's his father, which you don't misunderstand, that's a rejection.
Yeah. Okay, and so now we have a similar one where it says Hitkachili b'maneh t'neim leploni eina mekudeshet, almanachi kablemli mekudeshet. So we have a very similar thing to the one Andres just read, where instead of saying Ava or Avicha, it says if he asks her to be Mikudeshet and she says give it to the random dude, she's not Mikudeshet. But if she says give it to this random guy so that he'll accept it on my behalf, she is. And then it says Utsricha. We needed both the Tanu Rabbanan that Andres just read and this teaching about the Ploni. The Eshma'inan Abba ve'avicha hatamu dechi amra al menat sheyikablumli habu kiddushin desamcha data yovahu savra abdinan li shlichutai aval ploni la. So if the Tana had only taught us the first case, I would have thought, okay, fine, like with these non-random people, with like my dad or your dad, like I know or who are like related to the scenario, you would like, if she says like Amnat Shika Blumli, we'd be like, sure. In that scenario, they're being made into like her shaliach, and that would be effective kiddushin. But like with a random person, she like certainly she's not like turning them into her shaliach. So like Kamash Malan, this bit that we just read, that if she says that even about a ploni, she is mikudeshet. V'yesh mi'inan ploni. Hachahudichi amra tnei leploni lo have kiddushi kiddushe de lo mekarva data legabe lemitve lematana aval ava v'avich de mekarva data legabayhu ema b'matana yahavite nihalainu tzricha. So and the reverse, and this is similar to what we were just saying with the ava and avicha when you bring in the ploni example, right? That like if you just taught me the Ploni scenario, I'd be like, okay, if he said, be Mikudeshet to me with this money, and I said, give it to that random dude walking by, clearly that's her being like, no, I'm not interested. Whereas if she'd said, oh, give it to my dad, as Rav Nachum just said, like, I very well might have thought that's her saying like, yeah, like that's my dad. He's accepting it on my behalf, even if I didn't say that explicitly. So it needed to teach us that even if it's her dad or his dad, if she doesn't specify it, they're receiving this on her behalf, she's not Mikudeshet. Does that all track? Does that make sense? Okay. Andres, you could pick up with our third Tanu Rabbanan.
Yes. תנו רבנן, התקדשי לי במענה, נם על גבי סלע, אינה מקודשת. ואם היה סלע שלה מקודשת, באי רב ביבי, סלע של שניהם, מהו תיקו. So she's going to be given money, and then she says, why don't you put them on the rock? And then she's not mekudeshet. But if the rock belongs to her, then she is. And then Rav Bibi says, what happens if the rock belongs to both of them? And then teiku.
All right, we'll circle back to this in a sec once we finish this Gemara, because as I said, there's a big chunk of material on this in the Torah Shulchan Aruch. So there's an important Tosfot, but I think for now we'll do these last couple sections. So another Hikadshili.
Hikadshili בכיכר תניחו לחלב אינה מקודשת, ואם היה כלב שלה מקודשת, באי רב מרי, כלב רץ אחריה, מהו? Okay, so the same, but then she says, why don't you give this piece of bread, I imagine, to the dog, and then she's not Mekudeshet, but if the dog belongs to her, then she is, because it means she's accepting it. But what happens if the dog isn't to her, but follows her as if it was her?
Not follows her, like is running after her.
Oh, okay.
Specifically, if you look at the Rashi, he adds lenoshka, to bite her. There's a rabid dog chasing her, and she says, please give the kiddushin bread to the rabid dog chasing me. What's the deen in that scenario?
בההוא הנאה דקה מצלה נפשה, והנה גמרה ומקנה עלי נפשה, או דילמה מצה אמרה לי, מדאורייתא חיובי מחייבת לאצולן תיקו. So, So in this case, she has some, how do you say that? Some benefit because her soul is being saved from the dog, I imagine. And then like she's like, by saving her, she might be mekudeshet, something like that.
Right, that basically maybe the hana she gets, even though she herself is not receiving the bread and her dog isn't receiving the bread, the giving of the bread is saving her life from the rabid dog. So maybe like the hana she receives from that is like sufficient to make her mikudeshet, and this isn't considered enough of like a refusal on her part for that to be considered her like not wanting the kiddushin. Or what's the other
Odilo Matzah אמרה מדאורייתא.
side of it?
So that she has to be saved because it's midioraita, something like that. It's like you have to
Right,
rescue
maybe she
her.
could tell him, you're obligated to save my life. Like you're not allowed to just watch a rabid dog chase me down and kill me. So like, I didn't get some like random hana from you. Like you did what you were expected to do. Shkoyach, I'm still not marrying you. But since we can see either of these scenarios, teku. So it's going to be a suffix.
The same could happen with the debt, and then the guy that is paying her and tells her, "Lachenad mekudeshet li," he has to pay her, so she's not a.
Well, right. I mean, so that's a whole other scenario. But like, I think that we get into some interesting questions, and most of them aren't in the Siman around issues of like debt. But the assumption actually was in that scenario that even though he has to pay her, if he had said that and she had just taken it from him without refusing, that she would be mikudeshet, because like she is still receiving hana. It is something he owed her, but she is receiving like benefit from him, as it were.
Yeah,
But
we
in
saw
this
that
case-
explicitly in a Siman or two ago, that she can lend him money to give back to her
Right.
for kiddushin because of the time remaining to the.
Right. And even though she lent that to him, like that's still like effective. Although in that case also it was explicitly right, like with the intent of that kind of happening. But here we're like, there's these two sides of it, so it's a taker. So basically with the dog scenarios where we're at is that if he says, take this baguette and be mikudesha to me, and she says, give it to the random dog walking by, that's her saying, I have no interest. If she says, give it to my dog Sparky, that's her saying, I would love to marry you. And if she says, give it to the dog chasing me, unclear.
I have a question, or I'd like to hear everybody's thoughts on this. Is it, we've been talking about this as her rejecting the kiddushin, the kesef kiddushin, in the sense that she's not interested in getting married. But is there another possible thing going on here, or it seems like there's another thing going on here to me, which, and maybe that's the only thing going on, which is maybe it's just that she is not. The question is, she has to get benefit, and
so
and maybe we read all these Gemaras as just cases where the Gemara is saying that she's not getting benefits, so she doesn't get married to him.
I'm going to request just to table that briefly, because we get into in a lot of the Zembachs on the Sela case through these last few, we get into that question of to what extent this is an indication of that versus like acquiring a thing or receiving hana. So
I
we
think
will
it
get
even
into it more, and
pertains
then
to
people.
Okay, fine, we can discuss it later, but I think it even
Yeah.
relates to the first Gemara, even the first Gemaras that we saw today. I mean, it's possible even this. No?
I think that that's less clear, just because I think that like the earlier parts where the exact same thing is being done either way, and it's just like give it to my dad versus give it to my dad who will accept it on my behalf.
Right, so I'll
That in
explain.
either case, it seems to be that like how the money is being like received is the same either way. And it's
but it's
just
very
like
different.
the way she's phrasing it is indicating whether she wants it to be received in response to the way this guy is offering it, or whether that's her saying like, yeah, you can give it to my
Well,
dad.
let me offer my explanation. Perhaps the idea is when she says, give it to my father, so she's not getting hana. But when she says, give it to my father and he'll accept it on my behalf, and like we said, he becomes a shliach. Like the whole thing is that he becomes a shliach. In other words, the father is taking the money for, it's like saying, give it to my father, he'll put it in the safe deposit box for me. Now she's just redirecting the money, but he's a shliach accepting the money for her, and it's still her money.
For me, I think that like when we talked about scenarios like that, we said that the hana she gets, for example, is more like, okay, she would get hana from him fulfilling her word, right? Of like when she's not receiving something, because it also, again, we compared Ava and Avicha, and we said we didn't make a distinction between those. When it's Avicha, it's pretty clearly not like put it in a safety deposit for me. And so since we compared those, I think in either of these scenarios, the money is not going to her. And so if you were to say there's hana, the hana would be from him fulfilling her word, and that hana would be fulfilled even if she hadn't said almanat sheikablumli. He would still be fulfilling her word if she just said give it to your dad. And we say she's Eina Mikudeshet there, which I think is indicating that we're saying she's not interested. And
but you're bringing in the other sugya. The language of almanat sheikablumli does sound like it could mean what Rav Nachum is saying, no? Like that's different language from the language we saw when we were talking about it as her having her word obeyed.
Well, I mean, it's not so different than some of those scenarios we had, and we can compare those later. But the other thing is, again, I think that when it's comparing the Ava and Avicha and Ploni, that like all of those are ultimately given that we say, like, if she just says, just give it to them, she's Eina Mikudeshet, and she says, so they'll receive it on my behalf, she is. Presumably the random dude walking by us is probably not putting the money in a safety
isn't
deposit
necessarily
box for me.
a random dude walking by us.
I mean,
Ploni is like some
the
specific person
presumption
that
is
you
Ploni,
specify.
especially from the way that the Gemara is referring to it, Ploni is not a person she knows well. Like it's comparing the cases of people that she knows and is close to, who would be like Samcha Date, versus Ploni, where that's not the scenario, where the Gemara explicitly clarifies.
What does Samcha Date Ale? I think it says Samcha Date Ale Savar va'avdali shlichutai. In other words, the Gemara is saying he is becoming my shliach.
Right. So that's what I might have thought, right? That's all within the Gemara's Hava Amina. That's all the Gemara's, that's within the Gemara's Hava Amina. Again, let me clarify. When the Gemara is explaining why we need all of these is why did I need
you would have
Ploni?
thought that only certain people would be my shliach. And
No,
the end result is that all of them could be my shliach.
And also the other way around, which is that I might have thought that when I just say to like,
you're right.
All of them shliach, in the sense that all of them can receive this on my behalf, and also all of them, even though I might have thought because like I am close to or have this relationship with my father or your father, that when I say just like they should accept it, that is them accepting it for me.
Yes.
And that's not what this is. That we say that's not what she's doing.
So 100%. This tooth, the Gemara is of two minds. The Gemara is saying, on the one hand, maybe it's a question of shliach. That's one way of doing it. And there's another way, like it says, the meitav le b'matana. In other words, it could be that she wants to direct it as a matana to one of these people. So there's two things. In other words, they're both in there. Yeah.
So I think, so I'm going to say that, and I think it's a worthwhile question for the entire sugya. I think for the first part of the sugya, it seems to be that it weighs much more heavily on the side of this is really about an indication of her dads. And I think with these last couple scenarios, we get different opinions. And so we'll see that when we get into the Torah Beit Yosef. I'll just read this last bit to finish it up. We have Hiskachili Bekikar, Senehu La'ani, Eina Mikudeshet, Afilu Ani Hasamuch Aleha, Mai Tama, Amrle, Kihechi, the Mechayevna Be Ana, the Mechayev Be Ana, Hachi Mechayevat Be At. So if he says, betroth me with this baguette, and she says, give it to this poor person, even if it's a poor person who she's like taken it upon herself to support, she's not Mikudeshet, because she could tell him, like, you know, you're also obligated to support poor people. Like, this isn't you doing me a favor. This is you fulfilling an obligation that you have in general. And if you see a potential stira between that and what we just said about the Kelev, don't worry, we'll get into that with one of the commentaries. Okay. Do people feel okay about the Gemara? I mean, a lot of this builds very directly off the Gemara, so we will continue to have discussions about it. But if so, I'm going to get into a Tosfot. So if we go back to the Tosfot on the case of the Sela. So Im Haya Sela Shala Mikudeshet. Yavni, you be okay with reading that?
Sure. אם הסלע שלה מקודשת. פירש בקונטרסט דחצרה קונה לה. So they quote the Rashi that explains why if she says put it on this rock and that rock is her rock, then she is mikudeshet. And Rashi's explanation is because it's kinyan chatzer, because that she's acquiring the puta through it going into her chatzer. Velo nihira. And the Tosfot disagree. De'im ken mai bai sela shel shnehem mahu pshita. Pshita de'ena kona kevan dehu chatzer shel shnehem. And the reason the Tosfot don't agree with Rashi is because in the continuation of the Gemara, they land on a teko with if the rock belongs to both of them, and Tosfot say that it should be pashut, that it wouldn't work for kiddushin if it's an inyan of kinyan chatzer. דאמרינן בפרק המוכר את הספינה, אמר רבי ינאי חצר של שני שותפים קונין זה מזה, ומוקילה במודד בתוך קופתו של לוקח, אבל במודד על הקרקע לא. And the way the Tosfot knows this is there's another sugya in Bava Batra where someone proposes that you can a shared chatzer can be makneh from one of the shutafin to the other, and that is accepted only in the case of like a vessel or a basket, and in the case of like on the ground or on a rock, they reject that in that sugya. So too here it should be rejected. It shouldn't be a safek, or it shouldn't be a teko. ונראה לפרש דהכה הטעם אין תלוי בקניין חצרה, אלא כשהסלע שלה סמכה דעתה, ובשאינה שלה לא סמכה דעתה, ובאי כשהסלע של שניהם היא סמכה דעתה או לא. And so this is what say, so it would seem that the reason here is because if the rock is hers, then samcha data, like she's satisfied or like sure of that she has it. And if it's not her rock, then she's not confident in having it. And if the rock belongs to both of them, then it's a question. We lost Lexie.
Isn't this a weird? What does he mean? You translated it very literally, Yavni. But
Yeah, like
what does it mean? What does it mean that she's samcha data on the rock?
Yeah.
Okay, no, so it's not that she's samcha data on the rock. It's about her indicating like her will. Like I think like, and this is what I'm also using to support my earlier reading, is that like it appears to me from the way that we typically have been using the phrase samcha data and the way that gets carried through the literature is that samcha data is basically about an indication of will, right? And so what the Tosfot are saying is that, and again, this is where we see sort of the Sela being an interesting case of sort of distinguishing or an overlapping of those two paradigms, right? Where Rashi says what's happening in the Sela scenario is that it's not like so much about her indication of like whether she agrees to this, but that it's like literally like when it's Hasela Shala, it's like her Sela, and that functions like her Chatzer, and that it can acquire this on her behalf. And so the question is like, if it's not her Sela, it can't acquire it, and so she's Eino Mekudeshet. Whereas Tosfot say, if that's what we were talking about, then we wouldn't have a teku on the Sela Shel Shnehem, because we saw in this other Gemara that like if you just put something on the ground of this shared chatzer, that it's like eno koneh. And so this must not be about what the sela itself is literally doing, but that it's just like the way she responds is indicative of whether she's accepting this or not. That like we know she's like, oh yeah, go put it on my rock. But that's her saying, yeah, sure. She says, go put it on the random rock. That's her saying, I don't want this. And she says, put it on our rock. We don't know.
Right. Good.
Okay, so now we're gonna get into the Torah about Yosef himself. So we're picking up with Seif Zayin in the Torah. Ruben, are you here and able to read? If not, Masha, are you able to read? I can't tell who's here and doesn't have their computer on versus.
Yeah.
Well,
I heard my name, but I'm having trouble with the audio, so I'm not sure what my name was correlating to. Can you say again what you would like me to read?
if you're done to read Zayin in the Torah.
Okay, I have to switch things. Somebody has it open, they should go. And I can get it as soon as I switch my tabs.
I can read this for now, and then someone can pick up in the Beit Yosef or Bach. So we have Amar la hitkatshili b'maneh v'natalto v'zarakto l'or u'lechol davar ha'ivud u'afilu shalo davar ivud ela zarakto lifanav ina mikudeshet shezeh mochiach she'ena chaftza b'kiddushin. Right. So in this early scenario, we make it very explicit that this is about like chaftza, right? That like the what we're learning from this is her throwing it away, is her indicating that she does not desire this kiddushin, and so that's a rejection. And just a note on the Torah's formulation, which he adds the afilu shelo davar ha'ivud, which some of the commentators are confused by, because if we remember in our Gemara, it formulated it the other way around, where it was confused by that, and then it was like, no, it's like a lomi baya. The case where it's thrown right in front of him is even more pshita, that wouldn't be effective. And the Bach has just a little bit where he suggests that the Torah, I think it's a little dachluk, but it's an interesting presentation. Where should we pick it up? In the Bach, the very first Bach on the page, where hey, Amar la hikachiv manev and atalto, where she says havu kiddushin ka'amar rabbeinu ipcha. So it's the second to last line of the wide lines in the Bach. So ka'amar rabbeinu ipcha ibzar kol davar ha'ivud b'chol gavne ena mikudeshet. Ela afilu shelo davar ha'ivud de'ika gavna demikudeshet kigon sharakto l'reshuta afilu hachi b'zarakto lifanav ena mikudeshet. But the Torah is presenting an alternative formulation to the Gemara, which is that maybe you would say it's more pshita, that like there's no scenario where you throw it into a davar ha'ivud where she will be mikudeshet. But there are scenarios where you throw it not into a fire or into the sea, such as throwing it into her chatzer, where she is mikudeshet. And so we had to say afilu, even though sometimes throwing it not into a thing that will destroy the kiddushin does sometimes work. In this case, where she throws it in front of him, it's not effective. So that's just about sort of the Torah's somewhat weird formulation. We'll see that the Shulchan Aruch switches it to be more in line with the Gemara. Masha, do you have the thing open now and be able to pick up with Chet?
Yes. אמרה תנו לפלוני או לאבא או לאביך ונתנו להם ואמר לה התקדשי לי במנה שנתתי להם אינה מקודשת. אבל אם אמרה תנו לפלוני או לאבא או לאביך שיקבלו לי מקודשת. אפילו לא חזר ואמר התקדשי לי במנה שנתתי להם. So this is the same, she said, give it to Ploni. We have the order reversed from the Gemara, or to my father or to your father. And he gave it to them and then said, be betrothed to me with this maneh that I gave to them, then she is not betrothed. If she said, give them to Ploni, that they shall, and the other two, so that they will accept them on my behalf, even if he doesn't retroactively go back and say the magical formula, then she is betrothed to them.
Right. So what we see, like, this is like the Beraitos that we got in our Gemara, but we see that the Torah, it's actually not clear to me whether, I think he actually just brings these phrases in himself. I didn't see another source that he's directly quoting, bringing in this extra bit, where what he adds is that in the first scenario, even if the guy like says the magic phrase, like after she said, give it to my dad or your dad, it still doesn't work. And alternately, when she says, like, give it to this person so they'll accept it from me, even if he doesn't say that phrase, it's fine. And the Beit Yosef is a little puzzled by the Torah's addition, because for both of these, he has a very simple comment where he's just like, Pashutu. He's like Pshita, but in the first case, if what we're saying is that, like, Demashta Hibo, that like she, as Joel put it, like coyly refused him, what would it matter if he then says the phrase while giving it to that guy? Like, she's already refused him. That's already done. And in the other scenario, he's like, she's already made them her shaliach. Like, why would he ever need to have gone and said again, like, specifically, Dikachili, Bimanazo? Like, the Beit Yosef doesn't get why the phrase would matter in either of these scenarios. So the Bach has some thoughts on this. I didn't assign this, but is there anybody who feels comfortable reading some Bach? If not, Yavni. So picking up with Od Nireh, it's in kind of the middle of the moderately wide lines of the Bach on Rish Ayin Chet. It's near where the Chet is in the Beit Yosef. Od Nireh de Bereisha.
Od Nireh is the... got it. ועוד נראה דברישא נמי אין הדבר פשוט, דאינה מקודשת, אין הדבר פשוט, אינה מקודשת, וכבר היה אפשר לומר, דכשאמר לה בסוף התקדשי לי במנה שנתתי להם, ושתקה הוכיח סופה על תחילתה, שגם מה שאמרה תחילה, תנאו לפלוני וכולי, הסכימה בקידושין. So he says it's not pashut, and the Tur did need to say this because maybe you would say that that because afterward, because in the act he said hitkadshili bezeh, that I'm giving it to your father, just like you said, and because she didn't say anything at that moment, then that proves that her original intent was indeed to be married, because she didn't reject. But that's not the case. Kamash malandelita. There, right. אלא אדרבה התחילה שאמרה תנאו לפלוני וכולי, כלומר תן מעותיך לאחרים, מוכיח על סופה, דמה ששתקה אינו אלא לפי שלא חששה לדבריו הבטלים, ולא דמי להיו לו מיני rather the opposite, that her first statement is the one that dominates, and the fact that she was silent was just because she didn't have any concern about these silly words that he's saying at this point. Oh, blah blah blah.
Right, but he's like, it's not as pashut as the Beit Yosef is suggesting it was. Like, I totally could have thought that, like, if she's silent when he says that, like, at the end, that actually indicates that she wasn't so opposed to this when she made that first statement. So Kamash Malan, we rely on the initial thing. Okay, keep going.
ולא דמה להיו לו מיני כלים וכולי, בסוף סימן כ"ט, דכשחזר ואמר לה, הרי את מקודשת, וקיבלה, הרי זה מקודשת, דהתם קיבלה הקידושין לידה בשתיקה. ותו דהתחילה היא לומר לא תן לי כך וכך וכולי. אבל הכא דהוא התחיל לומר התקדשי לי במנה, היא איתה דהסכימה בקידושין, הבה לי לומר הן. אלא ודאי משתה בו לומר תן מעותיך לאחרים. So, and we're comparing, and this is not similar, we're comparing this to the other case where that we saw on the other Siman, where he has like these things that he's selling, or he has these things, and she comes and says, give me one of these, and he says, be mekudeshet to me, and if she is, and there is a situation where she becomes mekudeshet, and that's different because for two reasons. One is because sorry, I should have broken this up.
So one of them is that
because in this case, well, the one
liada.
difference is because she received it herself into her hand, so it's more of an act of agreeing to it, as opposed to she's watching him give it to someone else without objecting, and so therefore it's more likely to be an active agreement to kiddushin. And the second reason is because in that case she started and said, give me these things, and in this case he started, and in this case he's the one who started, and therefore she has to more actively agree.
Right, whereas also like he started in this case, he initiated the entire encounter. So it's like if she actually wanted it, she would just say hen. Right. Whereas in the other scenario, it's like it's this whole kind of like back and forth where she first like wants to get this thing in the first place. So it's not quite as straightforward. And I think we could also potentially like see this in some of the framework that Rav Nachman was applying, which is the liada thing is also that like there's something about when she's directly receiving something, she's also like there's more of a direct interaction between them. She's more directly receiving the hana in that scenario. And as Yavni phrased it, it's also like something which when she's the one taking it, presumably she would be even more likely to refuse if she dafka didn't want to be mikudeshet, as opposed to like somebody else just taking a thing on her behalf. And so those are why we're saying that like this scenario isn't similar to the one where she's like, give me this drink, where she accepted it silently there. We do say that she's mikudeshet. And here for these two reasons, it's not effective. And so just this last line, v'haidaka amar la.
בסוף, אחרי את מקודשת לי וכולי ושתקה, לא חששה לדבריו, כיוון שלא קיבלה הקידושין לידה, וגם לא עשתה שליח לקבלה מידו. And because she said, and here if he says at the end, הרי את מקודשת לי, and she's silent, she's not worried that his words are meaningful, and because she's not receiving anything, and she didn't make any shaliach. Right.
So in this scenario, like the Bach is explaining why, like both why this like wouldn't work, but also like why you might have thought that it would. So he's saying that like the Torah is actually giving us a significant teaching in adding this.
So Yavne,
yeah,
I just need a svara here. Well, let's take the first part that you read. What's the svara that we don't go with the Havamina that as long as she seems to be affirmative in the end, we negate what she said at the beginning.
Because
but then we say Kamash Malan, right? That we go by her negation at the beginning is sufficient to negate the whole deal. So how does that work for what's the logic of all this?
Because if we're confident that it was a rejection at the beginning, we think that in her mind she's already rejected it. She doesn't even she can ignore the shtuyot that he's talking about Mekudeshet at that point. She doesn't need to she doesn't need to engage
Okay,
with.
so let me try it another way also. And so what does that tell us about negation or non-acceptance, whatever term we're using now?
Oh,
In other words, how do we further define the notion of non-acceptance? That she's not makabel. Or Lexie, for that matter. If you hear my question,
something about it
how
having
do we
staying power?
how do we kind of express that?
Could you restate your question?
My question is, all this right now is teaching us when non-acceptance rears its head, and how strong that non-acceptance is. How would you summarize that, not just la halacha, but as what's it telling us about non-acceptance? So what would be a statement? Non-acceptance is powerful even, or when, or?
Well, first of all, there's definitely an indication of going more strongly off of someone's initial expression and assuming that that's like a more clear.
I want to know why.
Well, I think that and again, it's like, it makes sense in comparing a couple of our scenarios, but if we basically say, the Bach both explains that, like, yes, I get that there's a way in which you might imagine that somebody eventually not protesting when something is given to XYZ person could be, and when they explicitly make this statement again, could be a way of ultimately consenting to it. But when a person has already said something that we consider to be actually like a statement essentially of refusal, an absence of refusal, but also an absence of like actual acceptance doesn't negate the initial refusal, right? That the scenario we have here is words that we read to be her refusing, and then a scenario in which she just didn't refuse what he's saying, but doesn't accept it. That when you have a refusal and then just a silence, we are so mech on the initial refusal and saying that that was your intention. And the silence only works to be...
Refusal is very powerful.
Yes, and that silence...
A no is a no.
A no is a no, and to the extent that, like, again, as I've been saying, we're not always like emphasizing that you need such an enthusiastic yes, and we have these various scenarios where like being silent and accepting something has been considered like sufficient consent to indicate that you like are willing to enter into this relationship. But that sort of tacit agreement or that sort of non-refusal is only effective in the absence of an actual refusal, right? That like, that's only effective in the absence of factors explicitly indicating that you do not want this, that you don't need to necessarily say yes in clear language. But if you have said no, like a further, like a silence further on isn't considered a backtracking on that no.
I want to say in negotiations, all sorts of negotiations, once you hear a no, it's really hard to know KNOW, to know for sure that if a yes comes in, the yes is an actual yes. In other words, the no really persists unless it's clearly, in some ways, fully overturned.
Right. So that's
just I think, the way of, it's just the way of life.
Exactly. So that's what's happening here is that if you give a no, like you would have to give a really explicit yes to seemingly overturn that. And so the absence of a second no is not right. Indication that you've changed your mind.
So I'm sorry for just saying further. Sometimes you see in a negotiation, the person says no, and the other individual persists, and the first person who said no goes, yeah, well, and maybe yes, or who says something which doesn't really sound like a full yes. Okay, I'm done.
All right, so I'm going to suggest we'll break here for 5 minutes. We'll come back at 10:08 and we'll pick up with the case of the Sela, which will have lots of fun disagreements. Ben, are you up for reading?
Yep.
Where are we at? Tet?
Yeah, Tet in the Torah.
Perfect. All right, let's get started. אמר לה התקדשתי לה במנה, אמרה לו תנו על הסלע, אינה מקודשת. ועם הסלע שלה מקודשת. So basically, he tells her, be mekadesh to me with this money, and she tells him, like, put it on this rock, right? So on a regular rock, she's not mekudeshet. However, if that's her rock, so then she's mekudeshet. וכתב הרמה, כגון שיחדה לו הסלע. אבל אם אמרה לו תנו על הסלע סתם, אפילו נענה על שלה אינה מקודשת. So the Rama says that it's specifically in the case where she has like shichad lo ased, which means that she said a particular rock, right? But she said like put it on a specific rock, whatever, like just put it on the rock, even if it's her rock, then she's not mikudeshet. Now, if the sila belongs to both of them, it's a safek kiddushin. ומפרשים התוספות, דמיירש נטו לתוך חיקה. sorry, מפרשים התוספות, דמיירש נטו לתוך חיקה, אחר שאמרה לו, תנו על הסלע, אפילו אחי אינה מקודשת. So, why is she not מקודשת? לכיוון שאמרה לו תנו על גבי הסלע, אבל כאילו אמרה, אין חפץ בקידושך. ואפילו זרקו לתוך החיקה בשתיקה, כיוון שגילתה בדעתה שאינה רוצה להתקדש, יכולה לומר בתורת מתנה קיבלתי. אבל היא אמרה תנו על הסלע שהוא שלה, וזרקו אחר כך לתוך חיקה, מקודשת שזה מוכיח שהייתה חפצה בקידושין. ובשעה של שניהם, אבל ספק, אם חפצה בקידושה לעניין, שאם יזרקנו לתוך חיקה, שתהיה מקודשת עולה. Alright, so that's a pretty lengthy one. So Tosfot explains that we're talking about a case that is put it into a property. After she said, put it on the rock. Even so, she's not mekudeshet. Why? Because since she said put it on a, apparently saying put it on a rock means that she's not interested in getting married. And in this case, even if he threw the sela into her reshut without saying anything, since she already made it clear that she doesn't want to get married, she could say that when he gave her the money. Sorry, she could say that he gave her the money as a present and not necessarily betorat kiddushin. Okay, אבל אם אמרתנו על הסלע שהוא שלה וזרקו אחר כך לתוך חיקה, but if she said put it on my rock and then after that he threw it into her property, she's mekudeshet. Why? Because she already made it clear that she wanted to get married. And in the case of a rock that belongs to both of them, it's a safek if she wants to get married or not. Yeah, so if she already made it clear, so in the case of a rock that belongs to both of them, it's not clear whether she wants to get married or not, and that's why it's a safek.
So if also you're wondering, what do you mean Mefarshim Tosfot? They did not say that in the Tosfot we read. The answer is that this bit about in the Mefarshim Tosfot is basically word for word from the Rosh, who learns out from the Tosfot, where they disagreed with Rashi's comment about the Sela being Torah Chatzer, right? Where from the fact they said, this isn't working as from Torah Chatzer, it's not acquiring it for her, it's just like an indication of like Sam Chadata, that they're like, okay, it's an indication of her will, but then she still needs to receive it. So this must be talking about like, she said this, but then she actually did receive it in a way that would acquire it. Is how the Rosh reads the Tosfot. Yeah, so that's all. Yeah, as you said, a very long Torah. If you are down to read a shorter section in the Beit Yosef, we have the Beit Yosef that starts Umashikatav Rabbeinu Le'el B'Shem Harama. So this is on the first page here. It begins in the second line down of the wider Beit Yosef lines, but I'm looking for where it says Umashmali Demashikatav. It's like 4 lines down. Mashmali Demashikatav Harama.
Umashmali Demashikatav Harama, כיוון שיחדה לו הסלע, לאו לממרה שצריך שאמר לו על סלע פלוני, אלא אפילו אומרת סתם תנו על סלע שלי מקודשת. Oh, much money and one. Okay,
Uh,
just give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm just trying to to get a little more context. So would someone else mind reading for a minute? Sorry, I just need to catch up at the beginning.
So I can just basically, this bit in the Ramah is what you just read in the Torah, right? About how the Ramah said, "Sheyachda lo hasela." And so our question is, what does it mean that she like specified a rock for him? And so what the Beit Yosef is saying is like mashmali, that when we say the Ramah wrote that like "Sheyachda lo hasela," she doesn't need to have said on this rock that I'm pointing to here. Ella afilu omeret stam tanhu al sela sheli mikudeshet v'yachda denaka tainu lafuke omeret tanhu al sela v'lo amra sheli. Right, that what he thinks the Ramah is saying is like just that she needs to have said put it on my rock. Doesn't have to specify which rock that is, but that basically she can't have just said put it on a rock. Does someone have their hand raised? Okay.
No, well, Lexie, how are you translating it now? How are we translating yachda?
So yachda for the Beit Yosef is basically just the opposite of stam, right? So like the way that the Beit Yosef is reading the Ramah is that like yachda means not just saying put it on a rock. That like she has to have specified that either like she has to have said put it on my rock, or she can say put it on this rock, and if that rock is hers, then that's also effective, even if she didn't say put it on my rock. But if she just said
in English, would you say specify? Sorry for this, I know it's pedantic, but maybe not. In my mind, would it be specify or designate?
I think probably, I just don't think either of them honestly adequately captures the way the Ramah is describing the Beit Yosef, the Beit Yosef is describing the Ramah. And then I think he's essentially just saying the yachda the Ramah means here is simply to distinguish the case from where she just says put it on a rock. That it's basically yachda means not just saying it in kind of a dismissive, completely unspecific manner.
Okay. All right.
Okay, so that's the Beit Yosef. So that's how he understands the Ramah, for one, right? He thinks that it's not just like put it on this rock, but it could be like put it on my rock. That again, if this is about that like he thinks that she can just say, she just can indicate that she wants it to be on her thing, as it were. And then he also, and this becomes a big dispute, I'm just going to read where he says, right, that he says he thinks it has to be this way because of what the Reish and the Sefer are teaching. The Bach will expand on what that means. And then the last thing he says is it's not clear, according to him, whether or not the Ramah is cholek on the Tosfot. The like Hechad Amrat Tanu al Selastam is our kula to ucheka b'shtika. Lo nitba'er dat haramah. This is the end of this Beit Yosef. Lo nitba'er dat haramah. Im hu kadat Tosfot va'arosh sheyechola lomar b'tarat matana kibaltiv. Amrinan dekev datka vaday samcha ad dvarav harishonim she'amar lahit kachili v'zeh nira yoter. So he's like, it's not
Lexie, we're missing you. Right.
Yeah. Think that this is about like samcha data, right? This is about her indicating her will. And so once she like has just said Celestam, that's her saying she's not interested. And so even if she like receives it in her lap afterwards, it doesn't matter because she's refused it. Where be what constitutes acquisition, at least partially. And so he says for the Ramah, it's possible that scenario where she just said, put it on a rock.
Good.
The Kitzer, the Beit Yosef is trying to determine what are being presented as agreeing or disagreeing. And so he suggests that it's possible in the scenario where she just said put it on a rock without yachta, without clarifying, and then received it into her lap and didn't say anything, that whereas the Tosfot and the Rosh would say she's Eina Mekudeshet there because she like indicated that she's not interested in the Kiddushin. It's possible the Ramah would say there that like actually no, she's accepted it. She's Kona the Kiddushin. That would be Mekudeshet. But that takes us to the Ramah with an Aleph, who disagrees with the Beit Yosef's presentation. So does somebody want to read the Darchei Moshe Vav, the bottom of the page? Josh?
Sorry, just a quick question. So the question is whether the Rama agrees or disagrees with Tosfot, right?
Yes. The question is like whether the Ramah, and this is what we're going to see a big kind of range of opinions on, is whether the Ramah is like explaining sort of the language of the Baraita, but ultimately agrees with the Tosfot's framework that all of this is just about her indication of that, and that like basically beyond that would agree with the Tosfot's framework, or whether the Ramah might say that like in a scenario where she just said put it on a rock and then accepted it into her lap, that maybe the Ramah is talking actually more about acquisition, and since there she ended up acquiring it in an effective way, maybe she would still be Mekudeshet there, even though her first statement was just put it on a rock, which the Tosfot read as a rejection.
Right, but no one would agree with Rashi, basically, right? No one is going down the line of Rashi that like she's Koneh, that she's Mekudeshet because you acquire through your possession or through your field or through your whatever.
So it's not clear. I think the Beit Yosef is actually suggesting that the Ramah, and at least in the way people read the Beit Yosef, what we basically have is a dispute. Is that is a dispute as to whether the Ramah like believes that the Sela itself can't be Koneh, and that this is also just about her indication of dots, and he's just clarifying the wording, or whether actually the Ramah holds more like Rashi and thinks the Sela itself can be Koneh, as opposed to the Tosfot and the Rosh, who think that it has to go into her lap or into some other way into her reshut meaningfully. Okay.
Thank you.
So just a line on that. Lexie. So what's that about a rock that causes this problem?
I don't think it's so much. I mean, what we'll see is it's really not so much just about the rock. It's really kind of, what I would say the problem comes from is the way that we've been framing this whole Siman, and like, again, what sort of Reb Nachman brought up earlier is this sort of not totally clear lines between when we're talking about the questions of like what constitutes receiving and what constitutes hana, which has been a broader conversation outside of the Siman, versus when we're focusing more on like the chavtza b'kiddushin, as to when we're focusing more on whether this is her accepting or rejecting kiddushin. And it's not clear that these cases are so cut and dry one or the other, right? And so the fact that we're talking about both these things, and both of these are crucial to an effective kiddushin, makes this case not totally clear in the fact that like you could say that like, as we're going to see, just a rock that's just hers would work like a chatzer. It would acquire it for her formally. Yeah. And so on the one hand, we could see this as being more about like whether this is able to acquire things. Or we could see, as the Tosfot bring up in their Kushia, that the seeing this as a chatzer is more difficult with the Shnehem scenario. That shouldn't be a teku if this is about like just being Koneh thing. And so for them, this is actually just really about what phrasings indicate acceptance or rejection. But because we have that sort of ambiguity throughout the Siman and even beyond the Siman, this is a particularly potent one because a rock itself is like thing she could own seemingly, right? And that you could place something on the way you could place something in a chatzer, that makes it more comparable to that paradigm, makes it even more unclear whether we're talking about the framework of kinyan reception or that of dat.
You know, there are certain acts that lend themselves to seemingly to full understanding. She receives it and places into her bosom. That seems to be, a clear act. Iraq is like a nowhere place, and therefore there's more work that needs to be done to designate or to specify, just by the nature of Iraq, or that there's a special relationship of this rock which puts it into a Chatzar character, because Iraq seems to be kind of a nowhere place on its own. So therefore, the act of it coming to Iraq is not a clear to the observer. It's not a clear act. If you didn't have any lines, if you didn't have any subtitles saying this is my rock, it would look pretty strange for a person putting the Kiddushin, Shabbat Kiddushin on a rock. But if you had no subtitles and you saw her take it to her chest, it would seem pretty clear. Okay, that's my comment.
Okay. So also, I think based off time, the Darchei Moshe, we can basically just say, Bekitzer, the Ramah's opinion is that the Ramah with the hay does not disagree. The Ramah, our Ramah that we usually, confusing, but the one that we usually refer to, the author of the Darchei Moshe, believes that the Ramah with the hay is just expanding on this Baraita, but that he too, like the Tosfot, thinks that you would need to put it like betocheka afterwards, and that this is just about like the phrasing. And he like gets into the language of like the way the Torah presents the Tosfot, where it says umefarshim Tosfot, and the Darchei Moshe says that like that's language that's used when you're not bringing something as a plukta. So the Darchei Moshe's stance is that these two are in agreement about this all being about her indication of dat, and the Ramah with the hay is just expressing how that, like what words one can use to indicate her assent, right? That it can be shali, not just on this rock. I think sorry for briefly sidelining you, Josh. I'm going to read a drisha, and then you can read the Bach, who will comment on the drisha. So it'll be good. So there's a drisha at the bottom of this page. So I think with Katav Harosh, it's like on the bottom right of the drisha on this page. So Katav Harosh al ha'ibaya shel Rabibi sheba yisela shel shnehem mahu v'zel shono mahayida mocheret asfina dekam chatzer shutafin konin mekach ze mize umokila b'model letoch kubato aval al gabei karka lo v'im ken tifshot minei de'eno mikudeshet v'kahai gavna. Right. So this is just expanding how the Rosh presented the Tosfot, and how like the fact that the Sela shel Shnehem is a teku suggests that this isn't talking about the Sela being kone, the Kiddushin, because we should know that wouldn't work in this scenario. V'kahai gavna hikshu gam kena Tosfot v'yesh lamar dahacha ena davar talui b'kinyan shetehei kone al yedei asela d'mar hacha afilu zarak hamaneh letocheka v'hadik tanim b'raita tanam al gabei sela ena mikudeshet ma'iri afilu zarka letocheka v'kabalto v'chulei ועניות דעתי זה יש לפרש התקשי לי בכיכר, תנו לכלב, תנו לעני עד כמה שונו. So what we'll see is that most people believe that the Tosfot's position would extend not just to the Sela scenario, but also to that of the dog and the ani. That in all of these scenarios, it's talking about her indication of that, but none of these would count as like effective ways of acquiring the thing in and of itself. So most opinions say the Rosh and the Tosfot are extending this the Tocheka like application to all of our last three scenarios in the Braita, right? The Sela, the Ani, and the Kelev. that if she said these things, even if you then put it into her lap and she said nothing, she still would not be mikudeshet. But we're going to see the Drisha has potentially the most controversial opinion in that he doesn't even agree with the way we're talking about the Tosfot. So we have Afagav, the Masela Shala, Yesh Fara Lamash Mikudeshet, Afila Beloza Kafaka, the Hangabe, Kelev, Ani, Vimkin, Makrichin at the Tosfot, Vashiri, the Farish Shakol Zemire, Bizar Koach Arkaka. ויש לומר מכוח הבעיה שבעיה בסלע של שניהם, מהו? מוכרח הוא שמה דקטנה אצנם על גבי סלע וכולי, אם היה סלע שלה מקודשת, זה מראה שזר כוח אחר כך לתוך חיקה, שעל זה קאי הבעיה, ואם לא כן, מה הבעיה פשיטה דנה מקודשת. So basically, sorry that this is a lot in a short period of time, but basically the Drisha is saying the way people have been reading the Tosfot and the Rosh is that based off of the kushia of the Salah Shel Shnehem, then they must apply the fact that this has to be talking about dot to everything, right? That like if this is talking about a Salah being kone, the situation of the Salah Shel Shnehem shouldn't have been a teku, it should have been shita she'ena mikudeshet. So they must say that this entire Baraita is dealing with purely indication of dot, but that it would have to be latocheka afterwards, right? That none of these would be a case where the thing itself is kone. But he points out that other scenarios, like if it's hasela shela, especially if it's hasela shela and she's standing there, then that could acquire it for her. That like everyone would agree that like in general that would be effective as an acquisition. So Tosfot by Rosh. I'm gonna let's see.
Can I make a general statement? Let me just add. I think what's going on, I mean, just in general, I mean, to broaden this, or I don't know, broaden it, the big picture, I think, is that Tosfos is saying that it's a case, I mean, tell me if I'm right, that Tosfos is saying that it's a case of evaluating her dot. And then these, the Rosh and the Drisha here are questioning, well, okay, but then we still need to have an acquisition. If it's not talking about acquisition, you've taken acquisition out of the Gemara, then it's just talking about her dot, but we still need to have some kind of acquisition going on. And so for that, the Rosh says, put it in her, there has to be another step of her eventually reaching her, because that's not what the Gemara is talking about. It's not talking about acquisition. And Tosfos himself didn't address that, but it has to be assumed that there's some kind of moment of the thing being acquired, and therefore we needed to go into her hand, or like you just said, even on a rock, but the rock is nearby her in her Arba Amos maybe. I don't quite what the Drisha is. What exactly is the Drisha adding to that?
Well, so this part up to here is basically him framing how people have been talking about the Tosfot and the Rosh, right? That like the Tosfot and the Rosh think that because in the Salah Shel Shnehem thing, if we're talking about acquisition, that wouldn't be a teku, it would be pshita she'ena mikudeshet. Then it must be that all of these are talking about a scenario where it can't be kona itself, or just it's like clearly a case of like samcha data, right? And then also brings in the fact that people say, well, since actually the Sela and the Ani and the Kelev are all part of one big Baraita, like you wouldn't have to say that we're talking about Zarkala Tocheka for the Kelev and the Ani, but that like, because they're all one Baraita, people are like, well, maybe it's the same scenario we're talking about for the entire thing. But go to Aval, the bolded Aval and the Drisha on the bottom right on Rish Pei, where he's going to contradict the way everybody's been reading the Tosfot, where he says, Aval kol ze be'enai dachuk v'rachuk, shariga Tosfot sham, סתמו וכתבו שכשסלע שלה סמכה דעתה ומשמעות לשונם הוא פשוט ואפילו לא נתנו תוכחה אלא על גבי סלע שלה נמי מקודשת וכמו שכתב הרמה וגם לפי מה שכתב דחיקה דווקא אבל לרבנו לכתוב ותוספים וכולי שמפותה הרמה ודאי סביר לי כשאמרה להניח על גבי סלע שלה So interestingly, he uses the same argument that the Darchei Moshe does about the way the Torah presented the Tosfot, indicating that there isn't disagreement between them and the Ramah. But what the Drisha is saying is that the way the Ramah is worded suggests that the Sela itself is doing the acquisition, right? The way the way the Ramah is worded, the Drisha is arguing, suggests that this is in fact about the Sela itself acquiring, not about needing some further act of. And since the Tosfot aren't presented as disagreeing, he thinks that, like, yeah, even according to the Torah, the Tosfot don't require l'tocheka for every scenario. L'chein nireh la'aniyut dati, דמה שכתב רבנו, דאם אמרה תנהו על גבי סלע שהוא שלה, וזרקו אחר כך לתוכחה, דמקודשת, לא דמה תוכחה כאמר, לא דווקא תוכחה כאמר, אלא הוא הדין על גבי סלע שלה, והראיה, דהראש לא נקט בלשונו בסלע שלה, דמקודשת, דמרי דווקא בהניח תוכחה, והרבא מתחיל וכתב, דמרי הכה אפילו זרק המנה לתוכחה, והדק תני ברייתא תנם על גבי סלע, דאינה מקודשת, מיירי אפילו זרקו לתוכחה וכולי. הרי שכתב תחילה דמיירי ואפילו זרק לתוכחה, רוצה לומר דאיירי קשותו, וגם איירי אפילו מזה, משום הכי חזר וכתב, והדק תני וכולי, דבתחילה השמעינן הראש, דבאמר לי תן על גבי סלע שלה, איירי בכל גוונה, בין אם נתן על גבי סלע שלה ובין נתנו לתוכחה, ואחר כך כתב דבאינך בבא, דאינה מקודשת, כמה שמלן הברייתא רבבותא, ואפילו בנתן לתוכחה אינה מקודשת. ורבינו שכתב בתוכחה בתרוויהו, לא דווקא כאמר, אלא אגב שכתב דברייתא דסלע של שניהם וסלע שאינה שלה, איירי אפילו בנתנו לתוכחה, כך כתב גם כן הרישא. So I apologize, that was a lot, but I'm going to summarize it because I think it's easier than going word for word. Basically, he's saying, even the Rosh, even from the language of the Rosh, he's not saying that all these scenarios have to be letocheka. He's saying that the Rosh is adding afilu letocheka, XYZ scenario wouldn't have worked. In the cases where we say Eina Mekudeshet. Then the ones where we say Eina Mekudeshet, even if you then threw it into her lap, it wouldn't have worked. But that the Rosh isn't saying that in the scenarios where it's like her Sela, where it says Mekudeshet, that you would then have to throw it into her lap. And that the language of the Rosh she's saying is actually pretty meduyak in this scenario. And the Tor, who just applied it to all of them, is like being lav davka, right? The Torah, because he applies it to the scenarios where she's Eina Mekudeshet, just said this broadly, but that even the Tosfot and the Rosh would agree that in the scenario where you place it on her Sela, that is sufficient. It acquires it for her. You don't need to throw it into her lap.
Wait, how does it acquire it for her? That's
because it's her Sela. And so what they're saying, nobody disagrees. Like, even if you remember the Tosfot that we read, their whole kushya is based around the Sela shel Shnehem, right? That specifically in a shared chatzer, we saw that, like, if you just put something on the ground of a shared chatzer, that's not a sufficient acquisition. Nobody protested that the Sela Shelah wouldn't be an effective way of acquiring something, because we say, actually, no, that could be compared to just her chatzer, which would acquire things for her. But certainly if she was like standing next to the Sela, and so it would be like mishtameret l'data, or like the equivalent of standing next to the chatzer.
No, but what was the Gemara asking when it said, well, what if it's a chatz? Now the Gemara is changing its topic. In the first case, it was saying if it's entirely her Sela, then it acquires it for her, no problem. And then it's saying, and if it's shel Shnehem, which we know doesn't acquire it for her, but now we're asking a different question. Is that her dot changing? Is that a representation?
Because the point is, like, then do you need to say if it's the shared rock and he puts it there, we have her dot, but she still needs to acquire it. So that's the case that it then gets put in her lap?
So, right. So And this is
yeah,
part of
yeah.
why I think there are strengths and weaknesses in the Drisha's explanation. I think on the one hand, the Drisha's explanation relies on us agreeing that there are different scenarios being explained in the Baraita. On the other hand, it pushes back on a weakness of the way we've been reading the Tosfot and the Rosh, which is that everybody does agree that according to the laws of like Chatzer and how we've been explaining them so far, that if you just placed it on the rock, on her rock, and she's standing there, that should be Kona it for her. That should be effective.
Mhm.
And he actually adds this bit that we didn't read, is that you can read the Afil Tocheka even for the bits where it says that she's Mekudesha. That in a case where she said, put it on my rock, that even if she said that and then you just put it into her lap afterwards, even though you didn't fulfill her word, since she indicated her agreement, then the Latocheka is like an effective way of accepting it. So the Drisha kind of like, I would highly recommend, I apologize that I didn't assign this. It was a very large chunk, but I wanted us to glance at it. If you want to look more at it, I highly recommend reading this entire Drisha from like the beginning of Rish Ayin Tet to the end of Rish Pei. But essentially, he reads it in that like every case of B'tocheka on both scenarios is an afilu, right? But that essentially in everything, but in the cases where it is her rock, everyone would agree that it can acquire it, that you don't need to throw it into her lap. And that the Tocheka is just teaching us, again, Lashmu'inan Vuta, right? To teach us more than we would have learned if you didn't add that phrase. But he's a bit of a Dat HaYachid because most people do not read the Tosfot and the Rosh this way. So sorry for the long diversion, but Josh, if you could pick up with the Bach on the bottom of Reish Ayin Tet, where it says Kuntras Acharon.
I have a different version too. Give me some words.
The second one where it says Amar Lahi Kachili B'maneh Tanu Ala Sela and it starts Katav Maharoch, and then Trisha Dinire Lo.
It's in the Kuntras Acharon.
Yeah, Kuntras Acharon, and then
כתב מערוך. כנראה לא העיקר לדעת תוספות, לדעת תוספות הראש ורבנו, אם אמרה תנהו על הסלע שלה, פשיטה דמקודשת, אלא אפילו לא נתן על הסלע כלל, אלא לתוך ריקה נמי מקודשת. והעריך בזה בדקדוק לשונם, דתוספות והראש, ושרי מרי, what I mean? שרי מרי.
if I recall correctly, this is a phrase where it's basically about like apologies, but I'm about to disagree with an important person.
Okay. The master. זה הלא מבואר מדברי הראש, אפילו אמרה תנהו על הסלע שלי, אין הדבר תלוי בקניין שתהיה קונה על ידי הסלע, אלא שזה הלשון, הוא מורה שהיא חפצה בקידושין, ושאם אחר כך נתן לתוך ריקה בשתיקה מקודשת, אבל לא נתן בחריקה, אלא על הסלע שלה, אף על פי שגילתה דעתה שחפצה היא בקידושין, אפילו הכי אינה מקודשת, כיוון שלא קיבלה הקידושין בידה, או בתוך ריקה. ולא חשיבה הנחה לסלע קבלת קידושין כלל. וכך היא דעת התוספות, ומאחר שהוכיחו דמקבאי סלע של שניהם, מהו דליקה לפרש לבסלע שלה מקודשת. וחצרה קונה לה, כפירוש רש"י. To carry on?
Yeah, I think this last bit is just getting him into more summarizing, but explain the first chunk, that how he understands the Ramah as opposed to the Drisha.
I said, he says it's not about the kinyan of the seller. It's about her desire to receive it. I need some help
Yeah.
here.
No, it's basically like, again, he disagrees with the Drisha and suggests that, like, he says no, even the Rama thinks that, like, in a case where she said ala sala shali, it would still need to be thrown the tocheka afterwards. Like, not only does the Bach take it, he's like, of course the Tosfot and the Rosh require that. He's like, also the Rama with the hay requires that as well. So he thinks that, like, for both of them, both the Rama and the Tosfot and the Rosh, that all of this is just about, like, whether she's like Chavtza b'Kiddushin, that it's purely about, like, her will. And then all these scenarios, just putting it on the rock would not be significant, would not be sufficient. And so that in any of these scenarios, you would need to have it thrown into her lap. So that's what the Bach basically, he thinks everyone requires it going into her lap. The Sela is not Kone. And I'm trying to think, I want us to at least get through some of the show.
That's the way the Darkei Moshe was trying.
Right, so he's similar to the Darkei Moshe in this respect, but then he disagrees with him later. I want to see if I can find the bit where he disagrees, because there's a lot of really good Bach on this section. But basically, sorry.
I don't know. I still don't understand one thing though, because the Tosfos seems to say that everybody agrees that the Sela works, as you said before. So why is the Bach saying the Tosfos doesn't say that?
So
I
honestly,
thought Tosfos is saying that the Sela works. But that's not what we're talking about here. But of course, the Sela works.
Right. So I think what he's trying to argue here is that where he says "De lo chashiva hanacha al sela kabbalat kiddushin klal," that like basically like this sort of action of putting something on a rock isn't considered an effective way of receiving kiddushin, which does
even though a chatzer is, even though it would be considered,
even though a chatzer of hers is kone. The Bach here seems to be suggesting that actually, like, no, just putting something on a rock isn't equivalent to putting something in her chatzer.
Doesn't that argue on the Tosfos? Isn't that against the point of the Tosfos?
It doesn't explicitly argue on the Tosfot. As we pointed out, the Tosfot are only pointing out that the Shnehem definitely doesn't work. Like, indisputably, the Shnehem doesn't work as like Kinyan.
Doesn't Rashi say that the rock works?
Correct, but the Rashi says that the rock works, but various people have issues with him. I'm trying to. Do people want to? We can either get deeper into this Bach, or we can try and go through some of the Shulchan Aruchs and Beit Shmuel's and Chakam Mechokeks. We have obviously not a ton of time left. I'm happy to do either, because there's a lot more specifically within the Bach's presentation of things and his view of the Ramah's language. I did write up kind of a chart of the different, like the Drisha and the Bach and the Beit Yosef's kind of presentations of these different opinions. So I can send that out. I will send that out either way, but we can either spend more time looking into those now, or we can look at some of the Shulchan Aruch, which
I
people
vote for
prefer.
whichever one of those would make you feel less pressured for time.
I mean, either way, there's still going to be lots of fun content we get into right now, but let's go to the Shulchan Aruch for now, and I'll send out that chart. Well, it's more like a list, but I'll send out that list. And if people have questions about it, I'm happy to talk about it more, because there are some really interesting arguments in this section. But we can flip to the Shulchan Aruch. And I don't think we need to read through every single one of the Sifim. Most of the Sifim in the Shulchan Aruch are pretty similar to the Torah. Something that we do get, let's see, in the first section, let's see, I mentioned the Chalkat Mechokek Aleph. Mostly, if you remember last time, Asher noted that he was disturbed by the kind of informal sort of crass manner that a lot of this is happening for like very important things. And we saw that the Bach commented that when it says like Zarka lidata, the Bach said this means that like unless she consented to the thing being thrown at her, it actually wouldn't work. Because like maybe she even wanted to be Mikudeshet, but like you chucking the ring at her made her change her mind. But if you look at the Chalkat Mechokek Aleph, let's see, so he mentions the Bach, and then I would say pick up at, you see Aval Ayel. I can say for the Shirat Devor people, it's kind of right above where Aleph is in the Torah. Aval Ayel b'Siman Kufchet. Give me a thumbs up if you have it.
Is in the Chalkat Mechokek Aleph?
Chalkat Mechokek Aleph. A couple lines in, we start with Mipshat Lashon, and then Aval Ayel b'Siman Kufchet. So we have Aval Ayel b'Siman Kufchet. Huva divrei harama. Dahad tanan zarak la kiddushin karov la mikudeshet. Hanemile hecha de artsem ikra lakdushele. Mashma de eino tzarich ritzui rak ala kiddushin v'lo al hazrika. Ve'gam b'Talmud lo nimtzak pidazo. So the Chalkat Mechokek disagrees with the Bach and thinks that from this language it implies that she only needs to have agreed to the kiddushin, but actually she doesn't need to have consented to having the thing thrown at her. As long as she's clearly consented to the kiddushin itself, he can throw it to her. It doesn't matter if that's the form that she specifically wanted. And one thing that the Beit Shmuel adds is that this is if she didn't specify what she wanted either way. But if she said, put it in my hand, and he threw it at her, that we say that that's Safek Kiddushin. Because there, it's not just that she like didn't say, yes, please throw it at me, but it's that he explicitly contradicted what she asked. So even though she said like, yes, I would like to be Mikudeshet to you, he ends up, he she didn't necessarily want a thing chucked at her. And so in that case, even the Chalkat Mechokek would say it's Safek Kiddushin, but not Eino Mikudeshet, as the Bach suggested. Remember, the Bach is like, if she's like, Eino Ratzeh B'Zrika, it doesn't work. Whereas here we say, if she didn't want it, and if she like specifically asked to receive it in a different way, it would be Safek.
I just would remind everyone, Safek Kiddushin means we got a problem.
You still need
so
a get.
We usually need a get, or we need another Kiddushin. Safek Kiddushin is a bad situation. It's for Chumrah. Safek
We don't,
Kiddushin
right.
acts for
We
Chumrah.
don't like Safek Kiddushin. It's like, it's, as Rav Lenny said, like, it means that like, this isn't Vadai, so it doesn't like work well. And if you want to be Mikudeshet, you should do it again. But if you don't want to be Mikudeshet, you need to get a get. So it's not a great scenario. But in any case, that's what we think the scenario is, where she like didn't agree to the Zrika, but she agreed to the Kiddushin. The next like several Sifim get into what we did last time, right, about the Rishon Harabim, the Arba Amot. Some of the Chalkat Mechokeks and Beit Shmuels that I indicated to you guys present sort of a dispute as to the position of the Rambam, which you got a glimpse at last time, right, as to like what his view are of Arba Amots, whether the Arba Amots being Kona is effective at all in the Reshut Harabim, whether it's different for like Mitziut versus for Gitin and Kiddushin. So we have a variety of opinions on this as to whether some people say that the Rambam thinks that like Kiddushin are like their own separate thing and that Arba Amot does work here. And some say like, no, it's not Arba Amot, that the Karov La, right, which remember the Rabbi Yochanan opinion that it's where she can protect it and he can't, that works in Reshut Harabim. But Arba Amot, where she couldn't protect it exclusively, that doesn't work. Does that distinction make sense? Right, that like if we're in the Reshut Harabim, if it's a scenario where she can guard the thing and he can't, that everyone would agree that that works. But if it's within her Arba Amot, but we don't have like her exclusive capacity to guard it, in that scenario, it's unclear whether she would be Mikudeshet. So we have disputes around that. One thing I want to look at on today's material is if we flip forward in the Shulchan Aruch a little bit. If we get to the bit, I mentioned that there's a seeming stira as to the law that we have about the Ploni and the Kelev. Right, sorry, the Ani and the Kelev. People remember what the scenario was, that like, why did we say in the case of the Kelev running after her, it was Suffolk?
Because she might be getting a great benefit from it, and therefore be mucking herself.
Right, and what's the alternative side?
And on the other hand, she like he's required to save her anyway, so he's not giving her anything that she's not owed.
Right, so like she could say, you're obligated to save me, so like you're not giving me something special, like this was already required of you. Whereas for the Ani, we didn't say Safek Mikudeshet, we just said Eina Mikudeshet, right? Because she could tell him like, you're also obligated to provide for this Ani, so this isn't like, yeah, like this isn't something that is some exclusive like benefit that you're giving to me, Dafka. What we basically end up seeing, I'm trying to find, I think this is in the Beit Shmuel, but basically we suggest that maybe the reason that there's a suffix in the case of the dog running after her is maybe like, even though he is required to save her life, maybe the benefit that you get from having your life saved is like significantly higher than the benefit she gets from like him providing for an Oni she is meant to support, such that like in the case of the Oni, the benefit she'd be receiving is not so extreme and it's considered something he already has an obligation for, right? Whereas in the case of the Kelev running after her, he's obligated to save her, but also the hana'ah she receives of having her life saved is maybe something she considers so significant that she would still be willing to be mikudeshet. So that's like why we end up saying like, it's a little, I think some people here have learned with Rav Elisha, who teaches at Malay Geboa and Pardes. And when I once expressed to him how ridiculous some of these scenarios seemed, he pointed out that like, the reality relationship you would form with someone by virtue of like them saving you from a like, you know, rabid dog is probably different than the relationship somebody would form with you by them giving charity to a random person, right? That like it's still not the same kind of clear, like this is something we've agreed on prior, that clearly like I am consenting to under normal circumstances, but also like the benefit that you're receiving from someone saving your life and the relationship formed in that act is different than the relationship formed from just giving money to a poor person on the street. I'm interested in people's thoughts on that, but I think it makes some kind of sense as to the distinction there. Yavni, you don't seem to like it.
No, I don't, but that's okay.
Why don't you like it?
That doesn't seem like forming because him saving her doesn't feel like a great way to end up in a marriage, and it doesn't seem like a way to form a relationship. Whereas like helping someone together actually does seem like a way to form a relationship.
That's fair. I think it's probably a healthier foundation of a relationship. I think it's just maybe one that doesn't necessarily bond people as intensely in the moment.
Exactly.
Which are, you know,
okay.
I wouldn't say that many of the scenarios we're talking about are the healthiest ways to initiate or build relationships, but how we see people relating to each other in these scenarios, and again, like how we see them as like consenting to enter further relationship with these people based off of these things, is another question, a related question, but not.
It's also important to remember that the basis of a relationship then wasn't the same as when we think of when we look for a relationship today. You know, it wasn't like we're going to fall in love and we're going to connect. It's like, is this a viable match and a good family and a good connection? And you know, we think about it now, we look at it with 21st century eyes of what we look for in a relationship and in a partner, but that's not necessarily what they were looking for then.
Right, that it was much more of like, it's not, this isn't just saying, I think we often overemphasize the extent to which these like weren't like, you know, interpersonal relationships in the same way. Like, I'm sure obviously there's still, that is very much like an element to things, but a lot more of it certainly is about like the practicality of the relationship and economic relationship, like what this means for how you relate to other people in your community and things like that. And so as Ashley's saying, like the criterion aren't the same. It's the criterion of what it would make sense to build a relationship from aren't the same as if you're thinking primarily based off of like mutual feelings of love and respect.
Very few Harvard Law graduates marry people who don't have a high school diploma.
That's correct.
Just, so.
A last note that is not directly building off of any of the cases we were just referring to, but this just tacked on in the end of the Beit Yosef. And if you haven't read it, I would just really highly recommend, because I find it very funny. Like the very last Beit Yosef of the Siman is just him quoting a Shuva of the Rosh, where it refers to, I referenced this earlier, where like a guy is paying back a debt to this woman, and as he's putting it into her hand, he says, "Hareat mekudeshet li." And it says, as soon as she heard that, she immediately flung it out of her hand and started screaming that she doesn't want it, and like crying out and saying "Oy vavoy" and tearing at her hair. And it says, "Don't worry, we ruled that this is not kiddushin, not even a little bit kiddushin. It's very clear to everyone present here that she was not willing, that even though it went into her hand, that like."
But it was her money. He was repaying her. She's not getting a benefit.
Correct. But as
He's
Yami
getting what's
pointed out
Magiala.
earlier, we have scenarios in which even when you've loaned somebody money, they can be like mikadesh you with said money. And so the question here is about like her accepting that money with that amirah. And so we're saying, even though it did come into her hand as he's saying that, she made it abundantly clear very immediately that accepting it in her hand was not an acceptance of his statement. And so everyone's like, don't worry, like, afilu kol shel kiddushin lo yatsa la ba'ir. Nobody in the city had any like rumor that this woman is mikudeshet to this guy. She made it abundantly clear to everyone. Okay, we're already running over, so I apologize we didn't get to everything in depth, because I think especially some of these Sela cases, it gets really intricate, both just via everyone's views in the different shita and how they intertwine. And I think going off of what we said earlier, that part of why this gets so intricate is sort of the ambiguity around when we are talking about the hana that a woman is receiving and when she is receiving something meaningfully or requiring it, versus like the question of chafza b'kiddushin, that language they're using here, or samcha data, whichever language you want to use. The idea of when we're talking about, did the woman consent to or refuse this, Or did she, even if she consented, did she meaningfully acquire this? Did she meaningfully benefit from this? Or even if she meaningfully benefited from this, did she accept it in such a way that it seems like she's willing to enter into this relationship? And some of these are more clearly talking about one than other, but like we see that they get like really intertangled. And so that's where we see a lot of these more complicated shita coming out. So I'll send out a picture of the sort of list of like the Bach and the Drisha and the Beit Yosef's views of how these different things map out. Do you have any final questions or comments?
Thank you very much, Lexie. Very interesting
Oh,
share.
it was excellent.
It's a complicated moment of Kiddushin where you are doing two things at once. You're accepting money and agreeing. And so these two things can be confused. So it's a confusing topic, and you clarified it greatly. Thank you. Next week, we're going on to Siman 31. And of the people here, I think Josh is going to be presenting, among others. So we look forward to hearing from you, Josh, and the others. And everybody will be presenting Bezrat Hashem at some point.
Chag
Okay.
Sameach, everyone.
Happy
Chag Sameach.
Hanukkah. Chag
Laila
Sameach.
Tov.
Happy Hanukkah.